The first humans did not arrive on Mars as explorers. They arrived as survivors. By the year 2100, Earth had not collapsed, but it had become increasingly unstable. Coastlines had shifted, weather patterns had grown unpredictable, and entire regions were struggling to sustain the populations that once thrived there. Humanity was not escaping Earth, it was extending itself, reaching outward in search of resilience. Mars, once a distant point of light in the night sky, had become that extension. The journey took nearly 7 months. Inside the transport vessel, time moved differently. Days blended into one another under artificial lighting, carefully programmed to mimic Earth's natural rhythms. There were no sunrises or sunsets, only scheduled cycles designed to keep the human mind from drifting too far into isolation. The constant hum of life support systems filled the silence, a reminder that survival depended entirely on fragile machines. Every movement was deliberate. Every resource was measured. Outside, space stretched endlessly, cold, silent, indifferent. As the spacecraft approached Mars, anticipation grew, but so did something else, a quiet understanding. The planet ahead was not welcoming. It offered no air to breathe, no water to drink, no life to greet them. Only a vast, rust-colored desert waiting beneath a thin atmosphere. From orbit, Mars looked both beautiful and unforgiving. Swirling dust storms traced slow patterns across its surface, massive canyons cut deep into the land, and frozen ice caps glowed faintly at the poles. It was a world shaped by time, but untouched by life. The descent began without ceremony. The ship entered the atmosphere at high velocity, its exterior glowing as friction built against the thin Martian air. Unlike Earth, the atmosphere here provided little resistance. Every calculation had to be exact. There was no margin for error. Inside, the crew remained silent. They had trained for this moment for years. Simulations, rehearsals, emergency scenarios, every possible outcome had been studied. And yet, no simulation could truly replicate this, because this time it was real. The landing thrusters engaged just seconds before impact, a controlled deceleration, a final adjustment, then contact. The ship touched the surface of Mars with a muted force, sending a small cloud of red dust drifting outward in slow motion. For a brief moment, everything stood still. No applause, no cheering, only breath, steady, controlled, almost cautious. When the hatch finally opened, the first humans stepped forward into a landscape that had never known footsteps before. The ground beneath was fine, dry, and unfamiliar. The horizon stretched endlessly, untouched and silent. Above, the sky was not blue, but a faded, dusty orange. There were no sounds of wind, no movement of water, no signs of life. Only stillness. In that moment, the significance of what they had done began to settle in, not as triumph, but as reality. They were no longer visitors, they were inhabitants of a new world. And as the rest of the crew followed, leaving their first impressions in the Martian soil, one truth became impossible to ignore. There was no return to the life they once knew. Mars was no longer a destination, it was home. The first colony on Mars was not designed to impress. It was designed to survive. From the outside, it appeared almost insignificant, a cluster of low, rounded structures partially buried beneath layers of compacted Martian soil. This was not an aesthetic choice. The regolith above served as protection, shielding the fragile habitats from constant radiation that the thin atmosphere could not block. Inside, everything was controlled. Air did not exist naturally here. It had to be created. Massive life support systems worked without pause, extracting carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere and converting it into breathable oxygen. Every system had redundancy, and every failure scenario had been anticipated, because even a minor malfunction could become fatal within minutes. Water was more valuable than anything else. It was harvested from underground ice deposits and recycled continuously. Every drop, whether from condensation, waste, or human use, was captured, purified, and reused. Nothing was discarded. On Mars, waste did not exist, only resources waiting to be reclaimed. Temperature outside could fall below -60 degrees Celsius. Inside, it remained stable, but never luxurious. Energy was limited, and comfort was secondary to survival. The settlers wore lightweight adaptive suits even within the habitat, conserving heat and monitoring vital signs at all times. Life followed a strict rhythm. Every hour was scheduled, every task had purpose. Systems had to be checked, filters had to be replaced, structural integrity had to be monitored constantly, as the pressure difference between inside and outside created a silent, continuous strain on every surface. Beyond maintenance, there was one priority that defined daily life: food. Traditional agriculture was impossible, so the colony relied on hydroponic farms, carefully engineered environments where plants grew without soil, fed by nutrient-rich water solutions under artificial light. Rows of green vegetation stretched across sealed chambers, glowing softly in contrast to the cold red world outside. For many settlers, these rooms became a place of quiet reflection, because here, life still felt familiar. Here, something grew. Communication with Earth was limited, not by technology, but by distance. Signals took between 4 and 20 minutes to travel one way, depending on planetary alignment. Conversations became delayed exchanges, stripped of immediacy. There were no real-time voices, no shared moments, only recorded messages sent across millions of kilometers. Birthdays were celebrated alone. News from Earth arrived late, and emotions often lingered in silence, waiting for replies that would not come for nearly an hour. Over time, the psychological weight became as significant as the physical challenges. Some settlers reported a sense of detachment, as if Earth had become less real, more like a memory than a place. The sky above them never changed to blue. The air never moved naturally. The world outside remained still, empty, and indifferent. And yet, something began to shift. What once felt alien slowly became routine. The hum of machines became background noise. The artificial light began to feel normal. The strict schedules provided structure, and within that structure, a new kind of life began to form. Not the life they had known before, but a life adapted to a world that had never intended to support them. And in that adaptation, the first true step towards becoming Martian had already begun. By the year 2120, the colony on Mars was no longer a fragile outpost. It had begun to resemble something closer to a living system. What started as a handful of interconnected habitats slowly expanded outward, forming a network of pressurized modules linked by reinforced corridors. New structures were no longer built only for survival. They were designed for efficiency, for growth, and eventually for permanence. The surface of Mars, once untouched, now carried subtle signs of human activity. Autonomous construction units moved methodically across the terrain, assembling new habitats using locally sourced materials. Martian regolith was processed into durable building components, reducing the need for constant supply missions from Earth. For the first time, the colony was not just surviving off transported resources, it was beginning to sustain itself. Energy production became the backbone of expansion. Vast solar arrays stretched across the landscape, their dark surfaces absorbing the distant sunlight. Though weaker than on Earth, it was reliable.
In regions prone to dust storms, compact nuclear reactors provided a steady alternative, ensuring that life support systems would never fail. Inside the expanding network, space was redefined. New sections were dedicated to research, engineering, and long-term habitation. Living quarters grew slightly larger, more personalized. Walls once bare began to display images of Earth, oceans, forests, skies, captured memories from a world that now felt impossibly far away. But perhaps the most significant transformation was not physical. It was social. The settlers were no longer just a group of specialists completing assigned tasks. They were becoming a community. Shared routines evolved into shared traditions. Meals, once purely functional, became moments of connection. People gathered not just to eat, but to talk, to exchange thoughts, to maintain a sense of humanity in a place that constantly challenged it. Small celebrations began to appear, marking milestones, honoring arrivals, remembering those who had chosen to stay behind on Earth. Time itself felt different on Mars. A single day, known as a sol, lasted 24 hours and 39 minutes. At first, this difference was a challenge, but over time, the colony adjusted. Schedules shifted, biological rhythms adapted. Humanity, once synchronized entirely with Earth, began to drift into a new temporal identity. Children, though rare in the early years, were eventually born within the colony. They would become the first generation to experience Mars not as a destination, but as their place of origin. Their understanding of gravity, movement, and space differed subtly from those born on Earth. They grew taller, adapted to the weaker gravitational pull, and viewed the red horizon not as foreign, but as normal. For them, Earth was not home. It was history. As the colony expanded, so did its ambitions. Exploration missions extended further from the central habitat. Rovers traveled across vast distances, mapping terrain, identifying new resource deposits, and searching for signs, any signs, that Mars might have once supported life. Each discovery, no matter how small, carried weight, because it meant the planet was not entirely silent. And with every new structure rising from the dust, every system becoming more efficient, every human adapting more completely, Mars was no longer resisting humanity's presence. It was beginning, in its own quiet way, to accept it.
By 2140, life on Mars had become stable enough to feel predictable. And that was when the first real crisis began. It did not start with an explosion or a visible failure. It started with a delay. A routine diagnostic from one of the primary oxygen production units returned incomplete data. At first, it was dismissed as a minor transmission error, something easily corrected. But within hours, secondary systems began reporting inconsistencies. Output levels were fluctuating. Efficiency was dropping. The change was small, almost unnoticeable. But on Mars, small changes never stayed small. Engineers worked immediately, isolating the affected modules. Backup systems activated as designed, compensating for the loss. For a brief moment, everything seemed under control. Until the dust storms arrived. Unlike anything seen in the early years, this storm was vast, planetary in scale. It moved slowly, but with relentless coverage, darkening the sky and reducing sunlight across the entire region. Solar arrays, the colony's primary energy source, began to lose efficiency. Power reserves started to drain. The timing could not have been worse. With oxygen production already unstable, the colony now faced a second threat: energy scarcity. Every system depended on it: air circulation, water recycling, temperature control. Without sufficient power, survival would become a countdown. Decisions had to be made. Non-essential systems were shut down first. Research labs went dark. Communication bandwidth was reduced. Even sections of the habitat were temporarily sealed to conserve energy. The colony, once expanding, began to contract. Inside, the atmosphere changed.
not physically, but emotionally. People spoke less. Movements became more deliberate. Every action carried weight because every action consumed resources. Engineers worked continuously, attempting to repair the failing oxygen units, but the problem was deeper than expected. Fine particles from the storm had infiltrated external intake systems, slowly degrading performance. Filters clogged faster than they could be replaced. Time became the most valuable resource, and it was running out. For the first time since arrival, the possibility of failure felt real. Not theoretical, not simulated, real. Messages were sent to Earth detailing the situation, but help was months away. There would be no immediate rescue, no rapid intervention. Whatever happened next would be decided entirely on Mars. In response, the colony did something unexpected. They adapted. Energy consumption was recalculated down to the smallest unit. Rotational living schedules were introduced. Sections of the population entered low activity cycles to reduce oxygen demand. Agricultural output was temporarily scaled back, prioritizing system stability over growth. Even the lighting was dimmed. The once steady glow of the colony softened into something quieter, more fragile. But within that fragility, something stronger began to emerge. A collective awareness. Every individual understood their role, not as isolated inhabitants, but as parts of a single interconnected system. Survival was no longer about individual endurance. It was about coordination, precision, and trust. Days passed, then weeks. The storm persisted, but gradually its intensity began to fade. Sunlight returned in fragments at first, thin rays breaking through layers of dust. Solar output slowly increased. Systems stabilized. And finally, the oxygen production units were restored to full capacity. The crisis ended not with celebration, but with silence. A quiet realization of how close they had come. Mars had not rejected them, but it had reminded them of something essential. They did not belong there. Not naturally. Every breath, every drop of water, every moment of warmth had to be earned. By the year 2160, Mars was no longer just a place of survival. It had become something else, a second beginning. The colony had grown far beyond its original boundaries. What was once a fragile network of habitats had evolved into a vast, interconnected system of cities, some built on the surface beneath reinforced domes, others carved deep into the Martian ground for stability and protection. From orbit, faint patterns of light could now be seen across the planet's surface. Subtle, but undeniable. Humanity had left its mark. Life on Mars was still controlled, still dependent on technology, but it no longer felt temporary. Systems had become more efficient, more resilient. Oxygen production was stable. Water extraction had expanded. Food systems diversified, incorporating not just hydroponics but experimental soil-based cultivation using engineered Martian regolith. The idea of permanence was no longer theoretical. It was visible. A new generation had grown up entirely on Mars. They had never felt Earth's gravity, never breathed unfiltered air, never seen oceans stretching to the horizon. Their world was enclosed, structured, intentional, but to them, it was natural. They moved differently, thought differently, adapted in ways their predecessors never fully could. For them, Mars was not a hostile environment. It was home. Education shifted accordingly. Instead of teaching how to survive on Mars, it began to explore how to build upon it. Engineering, planetary science, ecological design, these were no longer specialized fields, but foundations of everyday life. Every citizen, in some way, contributed to maintaining and improving the balance that sustained them. Because on Mars, balance was everything. The relationship between humans and their environment was no longer distant or abstract. It was immediate, visible, constant. Every system was interconnected, and every action had consequences that could not be ignored. This awareness began to shape something deeper, a different kind of civilization, one built not on abundance but on precision, not on expansion alone but on sustainability. Back on Earth, Mars was still seen as a frontier, but for those who lived there, it was something more profound. It was proof. Proof that humanity could exist beyond its origin. Proof that life could be carried, protected, and sustained in places once thought impossible. And perhaps most importantly, proof that being human was not defined by a single planet. As transport systems improved, travel between Earth and Mars became more frequent, not easy, but possible. Exchanges of people, knowledge, and culture slowly bridged the gap between the two worlds, and yet the divide remained. Because those who'd lived on Mars long enough began to understand something that could not be easily explained. Mars changes you, not just physically, but mentally. It alters your sense of scale, your understanding of dependence, your awareness of fragility. It removes the illusion that survival is guaranteed and replaces it with a quiet, constant recognition that life exists only because it is maintained. And in that understanding, something new emerged, not earthborn, not entirely human in the way history had defined it, but something adapted, something extended. As the cities continued to grow and the population slowly increased, the question was no longer whether humanity could survive on Mars. That question had already been answered. The real question now was, what would humanity become once it was no longer limited to Earth?